Welcome everybody to the first issue of the CDR initiative, CDR Impulses after the summer break. I hope that you all had wonderful vacations and that you are all now keen to learn more about CDR and its different facets. Since this whole event will be in English, I need to give some hints about interpretation. Ja, herzlich willkommen an alle Sie, die Sie hier heute an den ersten CDR-Impulsen nach der Sommerpause teilnehmen. Ich hoffe, dass Sie alle schöne Ferien hatten und nun ganz gespannt darauf sind, wieder in den CDR-Diskurs einsteigen zu können. Wie Sie gerade merken, die ganze Veranstaltung findet diesmal auf Englisch statt. Es gibt eine Simultanübersetzung Englisch-Deutsch. Wählen Sie hier einfach in Ihrem WebEx-Fenster und links die Sprachauswahl, also diese Weltkugel, und da können Sie dann den Sprachkanal Englisch oder Deutsch auswählen und auch den Slider benutzen, um vielleicht so ein gewisses Overlay zu haben. Yeah, but now we are coming to today's event, and what we want to deal today with is one of the hot issues when it comes to corporate digital responsibility, and that is ethics in the big data industry. And we want to talk about the role of data brokers, aggregators, how they manipulate consumers, and what this means for data governance, both in terms of what politics need to do, but also what corporates should be doing. Members of the CDR initiative commit themselves within the framework of the CDR initiative's Code of Conduct to, among other things, responsible, fair and transparent profiling, ensuring consumer sovereignty and autonomy, promoting responsible design of technology and data handling, and taking responsibility for data handling even beyond their own company boundaries. Yeah, I'm delighted that we can discuss all these questions with a real expert on this issue, and I would like to welcome Professor Dr. Kirsten Martin. Kirsten is the William and Hazel White Professor of Technology Ethics in the Mendoza College of Business at the University of Notre Dame. She's also the director of the Notre Dame Technology Ethics Center. Kirsten researches on privacy, technology, and corporate responsibility, and publishes in a wide range of journals. She writes books and teaching cases. Her most recent book is The Ethics of Data and Analytics. Kirsten, we are delighted that you're here with us, but I need to start with one privacy notice, which is this event is recorded. Dear participants, don't be afraid. None of you will be recorded. And please feel free to ask questions already during the presentation of Kirsten. You can use German or English, it doesn't really matter. And I will never indicate your names because I will repeat your questions to Kirsten so that your names won't be in the video. And now, Kirsten, up to you and your presentation. And after these 20 minutes, we will have approximately 20 minutes for our dialogue with the audience.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you for having me. Will they start the presentation?
Okay, please start the presentation.
Thank you. There we go. Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm going to keep to my 20 minutes, and I will try to not talk too quickly. And what I want to talk about today is the ethical issues in the big data industry as I see them, specifically around the ability of data brokers and large data aggregators to collect data and then use it to target us in certain ways. And so I'll talk briefly about what I mean by this. And it's actually an old idea that information is power. So this is the economist George Stigler, who's quite famous in the 1960s and before for talking about the economics of information and the economics of privacy. And even they always knew that information was an ability to actually control or target people. And then we see the next that we have data aggregators that have a lot of data about us. And so they have a lot of power. And so what the problem, as I see it, is that we share information into a data sphere, usually with a specific company. And then these data aggregators are able, or data brokers are able to actually gather this data over time and grow, you can see, in power. So as I go to more and more websites, as I go to more and more apps, as I talk with friends, as I move around the internet in any way, these data brokers are gathering more information. And so they have our concerns, our preferences, our contacts, our friends, our family, and our plans for the future. And so what I'd like to say is that these data brokers actually know more about us than our friends and family might, because it's what we type in the search engines and what we look around online. And so in this way, they're able to then target us with very specific targeted personalized advertising with the ability of ad networks. And what I think is the most interesting is that the most expensive keywords to pay for from an advertiser's perspective are things that you wouldn't necessarily guess. These aren't necessarily the people that have the most money. They're usually the people that are most vulnerable. So you have, whether or not you're searching for online gambling, then all of a sudden that's a very expensive search word for the advertisers to get to be able to target you. If you're looking for cash in some way, if you're looking for cleanup and restoration services, these are all people that are seen as kind of desperate in some way or vulnerable at that point in time. And what's interesting to me is they're not always the people with the most money, but they are the people that are, they always are the people that are the most vulnerable at that moment. So what I like to focus is on the targeted manipulation is that a very defined idea is this idea of covert leveraging of a specific target's vulnerabilities to steer their decision to the manipulator's interest. And so what I'm going to talk about a little bit is how this is different from other ideas. And then also how we have these data brokers that are in the position to be able to manipulate without any of the safeguards that we normally see. Okay, what am I talking about when I talk about the idea of targeted manipulation? So first, it's the use of the target's vulnerabilities against them. So the specifics about using our vulnerabilities, knowing what our concerns are, it makes it different than just mere nudging. So nudging and dark patterns are an interesting phenomenon, but that's not what I'm talking about here. Nudging and dark patterns are efforts to get people, large groups of people, whoever the user is on the website, to be able to act in a certain way. What I'm talking about is actually very targeted to us as individuals about our vulnerabilities. Second is this ability to covertly steer our decision. So it's the covert part that's important. We don't know that we're being targeted for our vulnerabilities. This is different than just marketing or persuasion, which is very open. So we all see a commercial, we all kind of laugh and joke about how it's trying to be persuasive. This is different in that it's specific to us and that it's covert in the way that they're using it. That's the definition of manipulation. And then finally, the idea is that it's not necessarily to cause us harm. So some definitions of manipulation focus on whether or not someone was harmed or not acting, I'll put this in quotes, rationally. I'm not a fan of that word. But this is what I'm worried about, is the idea of actually just trying to covertly get us to go towards the manipulator's ends, as in the manipulator has a goal for us to act in a certain way. It might be in our interest, it might not, but the idea is that they're covertly trying to steer us into a direction towards their end. Okay, so why is targeted manipulation wrong? So what's so wrong about this? So one argument is that the covertness and the focus on our vulnerabilities actually undermines the individual as the author of our own decisions. It's our autonomy that we need to have. This is really focusing more on the covertness, that we're not able to engage with the manipulator in a direct manner as with persuasion, and also the use of our vulnerabilities against us. So our concerns and our preferences against us. Second is just an economist argument. We all know that individuals are seen to be in the best position to operationalize our own preferences. So I kind of know what's in my interest, is the idea. And this is one of the economist's main arguments as to why decisions need to be in the hands of individual people and not some sort of centralized power like a corporation, or they were more concerned with the government having this data, but we can see this with companies. And then finally, the legitimacy of the market actually relies upon individual choices that are free from fraud, deception, or manipulation. So one of the key things we look for into saying that some sort of financial market is legitimate, and this is why in the US the SEC exists, in other countries we have our equivalent of the SEC, is that we're focused on there being some sort of legitimacy, and this is why these governmental agencies go after fraud, go after deception, so that people actually want to invest and actually participate in a marketplace because they think it's free of fraud, deception, or manipulation. Okay. So this is what manipulation is, targeted manipulation, why it's considered wrong, so why we try to avoid it, even seek to regulate it. And so now I'm going to talk about how we normally, in the non-online world, think about targeted manipulation, because this isn't a novel concept or a novel wrong. What's novel about it, I'm going to argue, is that it's not being regulated in any way. That's the novel part of it. So first of all, normally in the economics of information, in order for one market actor to share your preferences, forecasts, plans, concerns, what your assets are, what your liabilities are, everything about you, your vulnerabilities in any way to another market actor, we think of that what we're concerned about is that market actor would actually grow in power. So that person would know our vulnerabilities, would know our concerns, and then it could be used against us. Now, this is true whether it's between two individuals in the marketplace or whether it's between a customer and a supplier. And so we can see this between firm and supplier. We can see this between patient and a doctor. We can see this with the idea of like client and financial advisor. Normally, coming from a business school, the goal is to be able to share information openly with a stakeholder, a supplier, a customer, a major financial institution that you need money from. But you need to know that information will not be used against you in any way. And so we create these legal entities legal regulations that we use to control that. And these are safeguards. This is the idea that we'll share information as long as there's safeguards, and that's to protect us from having the information used against us. And there's a lot of literature in the economics literature to talk about the beauty, and the stakeholder literature, I should say, one I'm more familiar with, around joint ventures, NDAs, alliances, contracts, professional responsibility. And all of these things are to safeguard the target that's made vulnerable by wanting to share information. So we share information with another market actor. In order to make sure that's not used against us, there are these trappings, these safeguards that are wrapped around that so that they can't use that data against us. And this is because sharing information is beneficial to us in some ways, because then they're better able to meet our needs. And this is true between two companies, and this is true between a patient and a doctor, or a client and a financial advisor. We want the sharing of information with someone that we can trust. We make sure we can trust them by adding on these type of responsibilities and these safeguards. So what's odd in this situation is that we're sharing information not necessarily with the data broker. People are selling it to the data broker. And this data broker is growing in power, just like the firm and the supplier firm relationship, just like the doctor and the patient doctor relationship, just like the bank and the client bank relationship. And yet we don't have any of the safeguards in place. They're able to target us, knowing our concerns, preferences, contacts, with targeted manipulation, and yet we don't have any way to kind of safeguard this. They have the knowledge about the individual, they have the ability to target the individual, and it's hidden and covert. Nobody knows. I don't know the data aggregators and data brokers that have this information on me. And so what's different is that the interests are not aligned, because there's no forcing of the interests to be aligned with a safeguard, and it's a data without the relationship. So while I have an arrow here as if there's a relationship, it's just one way in the ability to target us without any type of safeguards in place. Okay, so that was, what is this phenomenon that's so problematic in the market right now? Why is it wrong? And kind of how have we regulated this in other situations? So now I'm gonna speak briefly just about how we got there. So how is it that these data brokers are able to have all of this information? And what I liken it to is this idea of privacy and the magical handoff. And I think in the US, we're worse at this than in Europe with GDPR. But I will say that we tend to think of us giving up any privacy interests when we hand off data or information to another person, a third party, or a firm, with this idea that the magic handoff means that there's no ongoing privacy expectations, where Helen Niesenbaum uses the phrase where anything goes. Now, she's undermining that, but that's the idea, is that we claim that anything goes. And so we see this issue with economists who argue that privacy is concealment, meaning as long as I conceal something, it's private. Concealment is inefficient. We all know that in the marketplace, therefore privacy is inefficient. And so this is kind of how the idea of, look, more information is always better, it gets to be kind of infused in the way that we think about regulating, at least in the US, regulating this idea of data. But the problem is that whenever they assumed that this handoff was so magical, was that we only would ever disclose to trusted parties. No one would ever have our data, that we didn't mean to have our data, that no one, and this is kind of funny, but that no one would ever store much data because it was just too expensive. So the original people that designed this idea of privacy being inefficient actually thought that the government was the only entity that had the resources to be able to store this much data. And that firms would always be cheaper to ask for data rather than actually share or spend or buy the data from somebody else. So this was the ideas around privacy being inefficient and we would only share people with people that we trust really came from an old idea that there was no way to have a data aggregator market. They just never saw this coming. So how do we get out of this situation where we have data brokers and data aggregators having this power around the information that we have about us without us and having any ability or relationship? And so I'm going to say that there's two things that we need to think about. First, we need to stop pretending that disclosure means that there are no privacy expectations, that when people share data with a specific company, they have a terms of use, I like to say. They have expectations about how that data is going to be used and who it's going to be shared with. And so the key is to be able to respect that terms of use or the privacy expectations around it. And second, I think we need to focus on regulating firms merely in the position to be able to manipulate. So these are data aggregators and data brokers who, with the knowledge of the individual and access to our decision making, and they should be regulated to ensure that their interests are aligned with ours. And what this would mean is that we need to start auditing or looking for people to actually report back as to how they're using their data so that they're accountable to somebody. Because right now, ad networks and data aggregators are not accountable to anybody. So there's no market pressure on them. I can't tell them to give me back my data. There's no one actually asking them how they're using their data, other than I'll say in GDPR, they do ask about data subjects. And then second, and this is important for corporations, that we need to understand and hold customer-facing firms responsible for their relationships with third parties. And so what does this look like? I'm trying to look at my thing to move the screen across. So there we go. So what do we do? There's a lot of actors here. And so what I'm going to focus on is these two that I just mentioned. First is these ideas of the data brokers at the very top that have this data as it kind of comes from let me go back one. So as the people on the left-hand side in my screen, the gatekeeper, or I call them a lure or a honeypot, gets us to go onto the website. The trackers and the beacons gather our data. It's sold then to a data broker, a data aggregator, who then uses an ad network to be able to target us later on our website. And so you can see the different actors here. And I'm going to say there's two that we need to focus on. So first is these in red, the data brokers and the data aggregators are the ones that are the most hidden from us. We can't get access to them, whether they're furthest down the supply chain of information from us, and yet they hold all this data. And so what I would argue is that we need to think about auditing them and making them responsible to government regulators, where they have to report out how they've used individualized data, where they got their data from, and also who they sold it to or who they're giving it access to. And second, we need to think about focusing on these customer-facing firms as being responsible as to who they sell their data to or who they sell access to us to. So it's not novel to hold a company responsible for who they give access to. So the examples I'll use, at least in the United States, we hold hospitals and universities responsible for third parties that they bring in to deal with students or deal with patients, right? So the hospital is responsible for the third parties that they bring into the hospital to work with a patient for the data that they give to that third party. We similarly hold banks, for example, responsible with suspicious activity reports, where they're responsible for their customers' actions and to kind of they have to know what their customers are doing with the bank as a facilitator. And so we need to start thinking about these consumer-facing companies as holding them responsible for allowing trackers and which trackers they allow on their websites, and also which ad networks they allow to target their customers. And this is a corporate responsibility at the moment, and then thinking about being a leader in this area to say, I'm only going to work with trackers that abide by certain principles, or I'm only going to let ad networks target my customers if they abide by certain principles. And so this is both focusing on the customer-facing facet of it to make these people in the front here, the websites, the gatekeepers or the lures responsible, but also thinking about auditing the people who are behind the scenes and where we don't have actual access to them. It's not going forward. Sorry.
Okay, can we click it forward?
Thank you. There we go. So this is in sum what my argument is, that firms merely in the position to manipulate with the knowledge of the individual and access to their decision making should be regulated to ensure their interests are aligned with the targets. And we can do this in two ways. we can audit those third parties, the data aggregators and the ad networks, to make them responsible to governmental agencies as to both what data they're collecting and using, and then how they're using that data. And then second, we can start holding customer-facing firms responsible for their relationships with these third-party trackers, as well as the ad networks, that they're inviting in to the space of their websites and their apps to be able to target their own customers and users, and they need to be responsible for who they're inviting in that way. And I think my clicker's not working. Can you click one more time? And I think that's it.
Just say next slide, and we will do the clicking.
And next step. So that in sum was the presentation about targeted manipulation and the ethical issues that I see in the big data industry.
Next slide, please.
Oh, no, that's it.
Ah, that's it. Perfect. Kirsten, thank you very much. And it was less than 20 minutes. I hope that the interpreters survived it, but they're still smiling. So thank you very much. But then we have more time for our discussion. And please feel free to add your comments in the chat so that we can engage in dialogue. Before I see the question, maybe I have a first question of definition. Because you say the data brokers and aggregators that are working in the hidden, that are not visible normally to consumers and the public, they should be regulated in a strict sense by having them audited and so on and so forth. So then the question is, what is actually a data broker and aggregator? In the narrow sense, one could define them, as those companies that sell data about consumers on credit histories and preferences and so on and so forth, very specialized firms. But in a wider sense, one could also say, let's take an online shop, a big online shop, and I assume that this online shop also collects hiddenly data about the purchasing history of its customers. So what is a data broker? Is it only in the narrow sense, those companies that are specialized in aggregating and collecting data from ad networks and so on and so forth? Or is it also the other companies that might have as a side product or thing that they also collect hiddenly data? So what is a data broker? Who should be regulated?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in this case, the concern I have was around the non-consumer facing data brokers specifically. But I think you're right. Facebook would be another data broker who's its own data broker. So we have Facebook or Google or Amazon that has their own, its own ecosystem of data aggregation and being able to target as well. And so I think they would also need to be able to explain how they're using their data, because they bring in third-party data and also are customer facing. And so they would have to start reporting out. That's actually easier because they could have to report out, for example, because they're public in their annual reports. So this is something that the SEC could do to say that we would like to know kind of how you're using the data either for or against your own customers and how covert it is. In this case, I was focusing on the problem of data aggregators and data brokers being without a relationship with the data subject. So that was my concern, that they were the phenomenon that I was seeing that was an issue not being addressed. But I agree with you that there should be the same types of reporting requirements of companies that are their own data broker.
Okay, so I might have imagined that there's some participants sitting here that said, okay, I'm not a data broker, so that it doesn't apply all to me. It's not that easy, as we learned just now. Then the next question would be on the scale and size. Could you give us some examples or names of data brokers that you have in your mind, and how many data points do they normally have?
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess if you look at their advertising, like, well, Axiom or OpenKai for oracles, I mean, they say that they have billions of data points and hundreds of millions of people in their data set. So they'll say we have, thousands of data points or 3,000 data points on every American, so they'll, now I don't know that they have that, but that's how they market themselves to people who want to advertise that we know everything about everyone. And so the range, according to them, their own marketing materials would be that they have thousands of data points on each person.
Then the first question is on, for what ends are these data points actually been used? Is it only to create personalized advertisements, or for what purposes is this data actually been used?
So It's mainly, well, one is on advertising. It's also used on like alternative credit scores. So we have like, which can be helpful. So for people that don't have financial credit through the traditional systems, they have like alternative credit scores where people can see how trustworthy somebody is, or whether or not they're a good investment. They could be used for low-level employment decisions. So whether or not someone is hired, and they might do some sort of check to see how trustworthy they are as an employee, just based on not all of the data, but maybe a subset of the data. For somebody like Facebook, or in particular, they're going to use it to be able to recommend what they know about you for groups that you might want to join. That was kind of a disinformation campaigns. Even if you're on a Google site, the type of ads that you could be seeing might be pushing you towards certain groups. In the US, we had that problem with the recommendation of an insurrection. So it can be used not only, I think for national security folks, what they worry about is the use of the same targeted advertising system and manipulation that companies use to get you to buy sneakers, or herbal remedies, or join a group, can also be used for disinformation campaigns or the like. So the problem is that the apparatus for targeted manipulation can be used for commercial interests and can be used in other interests as well.
Perfect. One solution that a participant has is, or one question that he or she has is, would it make sense to think about data brokers who enable consumers to cash in on their personal information, so that it's not only the data is used and you don't know it, but that a person can benefit from it economically? Would this be a solution?
If they did use it for the consumer to benefit, what I find in any of my surveys, that when consumers are actually very supportive of the use of their data for a primary contextual use. And what I mean by that is it's a search engine searching to match consumers to, or users to websites, or if someone's online looking for a doctor and we're trying to doing that type of match. So if it's actually to their benefit and within the contextual use, getting them credit, getting them better credit, helping them secure a loan for a house, then they're okay with it, because they know that their data is being used in a way that they expect within the context that they're engaging. I think the issue is that's because we don't have insight into, and we only see the bad parts about the manipulation, that there isn't any market pressure to stop companies from using it in a not good way, if that makes sense.
Okay, and then if I remember, or you have this one slide with the ecosystem of all the different actors, the data brokers, the aggregators, the trackers, the ad network, and the gatekeepers, the honeypots. Yeah. So I would say the normal companies that might purchase some of the data that you just mentioned for advertisement purposes, or as a bank for credit history and to do the solvency check or whatever. But then you said we need to hold them responsible for their relationship with those data brokers. So first of all, is it legitimate at all from a normative perspective to buy data from those kind of data brokers? And if yes, what does it mean to hold them responsible for their relationship? So what do these companies actually need to look out for when they deal with data brokers and have a relationship with them?
So there could be good data brokers, and I think it's the responsibility of the customer-facing companies that buy the data or have a website that they sell access to the consumers using the trackers, to ask where people got the data, how was it used, like to have the similar type of vetting that we do in corporations around getting a supplier for steel if you're building a bridge, or an automotive part. You would never just buy a part not knowing how it was made or what was being done with it, or even use a vendor for, say, an employment screening application without understanding where did they get the information and how did they use this information and how is it being applied. And yet we kind of take data brokers in without asking those types of specific questions about where exactly did this data come from, how would I have to do this? I know when I was at the Census Bureau, for the U.S. Census Bureau, at their National Advisory Committee, this was like a main concern that they had if they were going to like use third-party data aggregator data to help them enumerate, just to even find people. And the argument that we made was that they had to create the good demand for better data brokers by asking those types of questions and saying, look, I'm a company and I need data. I can only buy the data under these conditions. Can you satisfy this? And they'll respond. I mean, maybe they'll say, no, I can't satisfy that, but it can create good demand for the data brokers to have an offering that meets the privacy concerns and the concerns that the company has to say, look, I'm only going to buy data under these conditions, or I'm only going to allow trackers on my website under these conditions. Those are other ways of creating good demand. In some ways, it's kind of, it would be odd not to hold Apple or Nike responsible for the third parties they engage with. We do that all the time. At the moment, we just haven't thought about it in the same way that these companies are part of an information supply chain, and that who they engage with as third parties is a part of their value system. They're deciding who they do business with, and especially when it's around people's information.
Create good demand. I think that you're totally right, and so many other spheres, environmental protection or anti-child labor and so on and so forth. We hold companies and we expect companies to be responsible also for what is going on in their supply chains. So the same should apply to kind of data broker or business relationship. But in terms of very concrete best practices, so what kinds of questions should companies ask their data brokers? Because I would assume that all use ad networks to get, cookie tracking data and so on and so forth. So so what kind of questions should one ask? What are the best practices in terms of taking responsibility for data brokers?
So I think that there are better and worse data brokers. And so I think you can ask one, like the provenance of the information, of how the information was gathered, and they should be able to know. I'm not saying this is an overnight solution that people will be able to like create the demand and then all of a sudden it was going to be there. So it's going to be a little bit of a process, just like we can't expect Nike to all of a sudden to kind of create a better supply chain overnight. That was a longer process. And so I think it's going to require asking about the provenance and the type of data, where they got the data, whether or not the people gave consent for the data to be given, what type of ad trackers and where did they get the data? Is this being used in a way similar to that the person would actually expect it? I think sometimes we get too much data. So how much data do I actually need to use? Is there problematic data? I would say the other place that we need to, there are two actions recently by the United States FTC where they made companies disgorge, get rid of their programs, their AI programs that were built on, I'll just call it dirty data that they didn't, that wasn't rightfully theirs, that they either got from a data broker that had just scraped data off the internet, or had gotten it themselves where they kind of scraped it in their own way. And the FTC's answer to that was, look, you weren't supposed to have that data. That wasn't yours to use. You got it in an illicit way or in a way that broke their privacy expectations. Our answer is not just that you don't do that again, is that you have to get rid of every computer program that you built off of it. And that was one, there was one in March and one before that. And I think that those types of actions will have ripple effects to companies to say, what good is it if I take and use this data to build an AI product or make decisions? If I could be vulnerable and it would be risky, because if this isn't actually on the up and up data that I'm allowed to have, that I could actually have to get rid of every program that I ever made. And so those are extreme cases where the FTC has to know something happened. They have to go in and see it. You have to be under the jurisdiction of the FTC. But I think it's an indicator of where we're going around holding companies responsible for the data that they're using, similar to the supply chain ideas around manufacturing or service, where we hold companies responsible if they weren't careful about the type of manufacturing part that they brought in or service vendor that they brought in.
Kerstin, I think that this analogy is really, really interesting. And I'm wondering, what are the maybe additional added benefits from being much more critical about how the data broker gets to its data. And when I compare it to, for example, social standards then in the agriculture supply chains, by being much more critical about where do you actually get your products from and how are the farmers paid and so on and so forth, actually there was an argument that quality also increased, quality of the agriculture products. So do you think that there might be, in addition to the ethical and responsibility argument, also other additional added benefits that might compensate the additional cost that you have by being critical, that you might not be able to buy from the cheapest broker? So what might there be for additional benefits from being critical?
So I think there's two. One is you can answer where the data came from if asked by somebody. So that's helpful. Second, there's a lot of problems, like when I teach the ethics of data and analytics, and there are a lot of problems that we look at where the students will ask, I don't understand, if they had just used less data, they wouldn't have run into this problem. And so we tend to think that more data is better, as if bigger data sets, even with lots of noise, that the bigness will get rid of the noise. I'm just putting that in air quotes. But that's not the way that this works, because a lot of times, like a program will actually pick up on kind of something that you don't really care about and all of a sudden decide, oh, the race of somebody is really important or where they went to school is important. And when it isn't important for that decision. And so I think in some ways you can actually, the use of the data is easier because you might have a smaller, cleaner set of data. I think the other thing, and this happens with environmental issues, is that there are more people that care about this issue, especially younger employees and customers, than we give it credit for. So in being able to say, look, we're only going to do business with these types of people, it's the idea within economics is it signals your values as a company, and it makes people with similar values actually want to work with you. So you're going to have people that are like, oh, we're actually being really careful about the data that we're gathering and using. I want to work for a company like that. And so that's an added benefit, is that it's kind of signaling kind of where you are as a company, similar to what we did with environmental. Many years ago, people fought environmental issues all the time, and now we're using it as like we use it as a marketing campaign. You know, we actually, it's a core business that we try to bring people in as employees and have customers that also have similar values to us around environmental issues. And I think the same could be said around the use and the gathering of data.
Kirsten, let us assume that you are the responsible person in the company that is now responsible to implement kind of these responsibility requirement. You have the backup of your CEO. You have set up your checklist in order to, with the questions that you ask your data brokers and aggregators. And based on this checklist, you have narrowed down the potential number of data brokers. And you have really one that says, yeah, we comply with all of your requirements. How can you trust this company then actually complies with these requirements, because there are no monitoring services. You know, there's no fair trade that will certify that standards are met. So how can you monitor that the brokers actually comply with your requirements?
I think honestly that's why the second part's kind of important, the auditing. So I think that we need to hold customer-facing companies responsible of saying only work with vetted, audited firm data brokers, and that way you'll know what's going on. It's hard right now. I mean, it's better than nothing to say we're only going to work with this type of data, and I need you to offer me a part of your data set that's only gathered in this way, or only this type of data. I don't need all of it. I just need a subset. So that is better than nothing. But it would be even better if we had someone to say how to, you know, like, because you're right, they could not tell the truth. And so what you need to know is kind of how would I be able to know for certain? So that another way to do that is to have someone that's auditing, either an industry group, like some sort of like seal to say that I've met certain security. We do this with cybersecurity all the time, right? Like, so you have certain cybersecurity minimums, and somebody checks to make sure that we have those cybersecurity minimums. But you're right, it only really works with the other part of it, which is that the data brokers and data aggregators are accountable to someone who's verifying that they're actually doing what they say they're doing.
If there are no auditing verification services available at this time, is there anything that the company that you as the responsible person could be doing? Could you ask, you know, to have a look into the systems? I don't know, is this realistic?
Yeah. I mean, they can put it in the contract that they're giving it on. So then it would be a contractual problem if they actually turned out not to be doing what they're saying they're doing. And usually, honestly, if it's in a contract, the lawyers, I mean, I'm not saying that companies don't lie in their contracts, but it's a lot meatier than just promising it in marketing campaign. So I think when the lawyers get involved and say that something's in a contract, it has a little bit more teeth than going off of what their marketing campaign. In my old job, like many decades ago, I was a systems consultant, and they used to bring us in to work with vendors, that were trying to sell big ERP systems like enterprise resource planning. And the reason was that they would tell the client something, but you needed to have a very knowledgeable person to say, wait, that's not how that system works. Do you actually, is this beta tested? Is this, and ask those types of critical questions. So some of it is on the client side, is having an expertise in the area to be able to ask those critical questions of a vendor. And sometimes the wrong people might be asking those questions of the vendor. You need someone who's actually a computer scientist to ask specifically, like what techniques are they using to gather the data?
Kirsten, we need all this because you say it is so bad. But what is actually so bad, or is it actually so new, this manipulation? Because if I look at whatever classical leaflet advertisement, why do I get it in my letterbox? Because, the companies that paying for it wants me to purchase whatever the beef that is promoted there. So it has an impact on my purchasing decision, or it's supposed to have. Or whatever in TV commercials, they try to change my preferences. So what is different about all this that you mentioned?
No, and I think, and so I think within the marketing literature and the idea of persuasion that's open, so they don't know the leaflet that's coming to you is not specific to you, it's everybody in your neighborhood. And they're kind of openly, you kind of know why you're getting it. It's because you're in a certain proximity, or it's not targeted specifically to you. The difference would be is if you got specific targeting, and even the leaflet comes as if it's an advertisement, like what they're doing when it comes to you, versus the subtlety of the advertising or the Facebook recommendation into groups or moving you onto one product or another is a little bit more subtle, that you don't know that they're coming at you in such a targeted way, or you don't know why they're coming at you. So you don't realize that they know your medical diagnosis, or that you're concerned that your child has a medical diagnosis, or you're looking to buy a new car, or you're looking to leave your place of employment. These are all places, pivotal moments that data brokers will know it's going on with you, and you don't actually realize. So I'll give an example. My doctoral student was pregnant, and somehow the data brokers found out that she was pregnant. And a bank called her to offer her life insurance for her child, and was really targeting her about how it would, like, pretty much you'd be a bad mom. This is when she was in Spain. She was a doctoral student in Spain, and targeting her as to why she'd be kind of a bad mom, and really laying it on heavy. And you could tell she was very upset about this call and this targeting. And she was still thrown. I mean, this is someone who is a PhD student. She's well aware of this problem that they have in data brokers and how they work. And yet it still kind of threw her as to whether or not she should be. So thinking about life insurance for a child that was not born. And so I would say that it's so subtle, the use of this on a very targeted way to a specific person's vulnerability, that's why I don't want to talk about, I agree, marketing and persuasion, broad ad campaigns that are kind of comically targeted at a certain age group is almost funny. You see them and you're like, who buys that stuff? This is much more subtle. The incidence of Facebook, for Facebook, just an example, their targeting of groups within the United States, militia groups in the United States, they found that 60% of the people who joined those groups was based on the Facebook recommendation. Okay. They didn't find those groups organically. It was based on Facebook's recommendation, knowing the attributes of the person might be more likely to join one of these militia groups. That's a staggering. This shows you how good it is at actually getting and being manipulative about getting people to join. Now that was for a bad end. I think we would say it was a bad end. It was beneficial to Facebook because it got more engagement, but as a society, that was a bad end. And for the person, it was a bad end.
Kirsten, unfortunately, we need to come to an end, and there is a final question. What can I, as an individual, do to navigate through this manipulation, if I can at all?
Yeah. So one, as an individual, not working at a company, as an individual, one thing that I do is I use anti-tracking devices. So that's one thing that I use on I use one called Ghostery. And that is, it's Ghostery. It's a little purple ghost. And that will actually, you add it to your browser and that actually stops tracking. I find that to be extremely helpful. The other thing is that, in some ways, manipulation only works because people don't know it's working. Manipulation is not covert. That's the key. And so as long as more people know about it, then they'll know, okay, I know why I'm getting this ad, or they could be actually targeting me for this reason. I don't know if I need this herbal supplement, or I don't really need to go gambling, because they just think that I'm actually need to go gambling.
Kirsten, in a 20-second nutshell, so what is your recommendation to those companies that are not a data broker, but that rely on the data of data brokers? So in terms of their corporate digital responsibility, what they should they do? What are the 3 key takeaways?
I'd say the key takeaways for a normal company is both being aware of the trackers that you're letting into the website, depending on what type of website that you have or app. And because a lot of that is not actually known by the companies. It's kind of, they're stuck on their websites and their apps to be able to kind of track the people that are on it. But the second is to be aware and treat buying of data the same as we buy any other supply, and to treat it with the same type of rigor to understand who do I want to partner with within my corporation and what type of data do I want to use, and treat it in a similar way that we do with other supply chains.
Kirsten, I think that if we were sitting here together in an auditorium in presence, there would be a big applause at this moment. Thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing your thoughts. I think that we all learned a lot, and you see all the symbols here in WebEx. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. This has been great. I really appreciate it.
That brings me to the outlook. Next month, on the 5th of October, we're going to see each other again from 4 to 4:45 on the 5th of October. The topic will also have something to do with data, but it will be data minimalism and environmental protection. Employees clean up at the digital spring cleaning. And what you will hear is from the Otto Group, how they conducted this employees cleaning of data and how this motivated the whole group and what it did for data minimalism and for the environment. And our guest will be Melissa Kühn. She is a corporate responsibility manager at the Otto Group. And Otto Group, as you might know, is also a member of the CDR initiative. Furthermore, if you did not yet have a chance to have a look at the CDR talks from CDR Code to Code, the video formats, then please check out these great videos that shed some insights into what is CDR really all about. Thank you very much again to Kirsten Martin, and thank you very much to you and all your questions. I hope that you enjoyed the sessions and hope to see you again in October. Bye-bye.